It really boils down to this, that all life is interrelated. We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny, and whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. We are made to live together because of the interrelated structure of reality.
Hello, I'm Dale Latour. Preaching, education, community, church missions that need to take on the gravity of the task. Denominational levels too, along with the local. If the church is going to avoid exhibiting yet another glaring absence of relevance to a deep concern of millions, then the climate crisis is screaming out for attention. Margaret Swedish, author of Living Beyond the End of the World, has some spot-on thoughts on this. Those who think I'm too dire may not appreciate how much the planet is changing, how irreversible the process is now as the Earth responds to our industrial civilization. And Pope Francis recently wrote, "We can no longer remain silent before one of the greatest environmental crises in world history." Hear this, the church everywhere. Hear this, Church in the United States. Hear this, United Methodist, and of course all denominations, even Southern Baptist, my parental denomination, my roots. Looking at the denomination's self-identity through what's on their homepage, there's not much there on any of them, unless you count drop-down menus, in which case there are but a couple where the word climate or environment or ecology occurs even then. I find myself getting increasingly frustrated with this. Everything else gets written about, even controversial issues, such as race, gender, immigration, politics, but the climate crisis is dramatically rare. Why is this? Why is it so hard for churches to talk about? Naomi Klein, again from that book which finally pushed me through that door of awareness, This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate, wrote, "We deny because we fear that letting in the full reality of this crisis will change everything." And we are right. Or in the tradition of the gentle nudge, she also writes, "We look at the crisis, but tell ourselves that all we can do is focus on ourselves. Meditate and shop at farmers markets and stop driving, but forget trying to actually change the systems that are making the crisis inevitable, because that's too much bad energy. And it will never work. And at first it may appear as if we are looking, because many of these lifestyle changes are indeed part of the solution, but we still have one eye tightly shut." So why do the denominational media seem to avoid it? I'm nowhere near satisfied with an article every 2 or 3 months. That doesn't say crisis to me. And it doesn't say it to the millions of people out there outside the church who see yet another glaring omission in the church's life and work. There are groups within churches who are responding, which again poses the question, why aren't the denominational media, who seem to love highlighting activity amongst their own, not tell this story? And they will claim, but we do. And then I look and I see one every 3 or 4 months. It's disturbing. From the pulpit, the same story seems to prevail, but again, with a few exceptions. Which brings us to this.
Some people wonder what fracking has to do with people of faith. And I always explain to them that, sadly, fracking is sort of the perfect storm, where you see this combination of corporate interests and fossil fuel extraction, environmental degradation, complete disengagement from what community means, and the violation of rights of individuals and families. So it's really important that we stand alongside and give voice to those who are suffering from extreme fossil fuel extraction.
That was the Reverend Dr. Leah Schade, pastor of United in Christ Lutheran Church in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. She's written a book, Creation Crisis Preaching, Ecology, Theology, and the Pulpit. I asked Leah on a Skype call in October 2014 how she came to an ecocentric place in her preaching.
Well, I grew up in Pennsylvania, and I've fished and walked the woods and hunted and everything in Pennsylvania. So this is sort of this is home for me. Although I did live in Virginia for a while, where I went to school, but at a very early age, I witnessed different times where forests that I played in or that I walked through were destroyed through development or just, sales of lumber. And I remember feeling so powerless. And, I would, and I would say to the adults around me, my parents or whoever, I can't believe that they would do this. And it was always just, well, it's their land. They can do what they want. It's their money. And always feeling like there was something that I needed to do, and yet feeling very young, very voiceless. And so that kind of shaped, those were some of the formative experiences for me. And then when I went into ministry, I started an ecology ministry, an eco ministry in my first congregation. And I really saw a connection between my faith and care of creation. So that would have been, oh my gosh, probably 10 years ago that I started that ministry. And they're still going. I left that church to start my PhD program, but they're still going. That makes me very happy. But I discerned probably about 3 years into my first call that I wanted to go back to get my PhD in homiletics. And so I applied the first time around and got fairly close on Vanderbilt. And but I was like second in line, and they were only picking one, so I didn't get in. But I had a conversation with John McClure, who's the head of the department there, and I said, what can I do? Because I really feel called to teach preaching. And he said, you need to find a laser focus for your research, and what can you contribute to the academy through your work. And the whole time I was there, I kept asking the professors, what are you doing about homiletics and ecological theology? And no one was doing anything. I mean, it was just not on anybody's radar. So I discerned that that's where I needed to really focus when I finally did get accepted. That's what I wanted to focus on. So I've just been really working on developing this Lutheran ecofeminist Christology for homiletic theory and practice. And then when I was doing my PhD work at the Lutheran Seminary at Philadelphia, which is where I got my MDiv, I also got very involved in the anti-fracking movement and became sort of a fractivist, and went to a lot of meetings and demonstrations, and some of that's in the book as well, and just became more of an advocate and activist along those issues, and clean air, clean water. And then in my own community here, where I've moved, I've been here for 4 years at United in Christ, which is, it's in central Pennsylvania, along the Susquehanna River. They wanted to put a tire incinerator in this area, and I ended up becoming sort of a community activist to prevent this tire burner from going in. And that was a really educational experience, sort of getting the community all together across different political spectrums and economic levels and walks of life. And we actually, the burner isn't going in. So that's really been a huge endeavor, but one that was well worth it.
I had previously seen, just after finding out about the coming release of Leah's book, an article about the film Merchants of Doubt, based on the book of that title by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway, which I had just read. And so I was looking up reviews and reactions to it and found her review, and also that she had been on a panel discussion at the Campus Theater in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, sponsored by the Susquehanna Valley Progressives and the Rivertown Coalition for Clean Water and Clean Air.
The thing that we're really struggling with is how to communicate exactly what we're dealing with to people who are non-environmentalists, have absolutely no interest in this, and trying to find metaphors for how to get a handle, like mentally, why are people blocking this? You know, like they're on the Titanic, and you know, as long as I've got my champagne and my tuxedo, and you know, I really don't care, and we're all going to go down. But some of us are going to go down much quicker and are not going to have access to the lifeboats. And so we're trying to find ways to communicate, to build community, and really prepare for what is coming. Yeah. That's one thing that's really on my heart and mind these days. And it's so important for those of us doing this work to be connected to each other. Absolutely. And to have these conversations, to be sharing the information, the insights, and just knowing that we're not alone in this. It can be a very isolating experience doing this work.
In a later conversation with Leah, she had just returned from Salt Lake City after attending the Parliament of World Religions, where she had done a presentation on creation crisis preaching.
I talked about the principles behind it, the theory behind it. Then I actually did the sermon of the woman at the well, preached from water's perspective, and it was very well received. And the focus, one of the foci of the Parliament this year was on climate change and environmental issues. So between that and the women's issues, I think that's one of the reasons my particular proposal was accepted, because mine spoke to both of those in the session.
I do not use this term flippantly or without caution. Rather, this word choice arises out of my understanding of what constituted Jesus' crucifixion, the torture and death of an innocent being for the purpose of strengthening and furthering the power of what Walter Wink calls the domination system.
Well, the notion, I draw on the work of Mark Wallace, who is professor of religion at Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania. And the way he develops it is to say that the crucifixion is not just a one-time event, that really the torture and murder of innocent people for political purposes continues to happen throughout history. And he makes the connection with earth being the embodiment of the Holy Spirit, so that when we are doing things to the environment that really kill the ability of earth to sustain life, then we are in fact creating a cruciform spirit, that the very spirit of life is being killed again, over and over again. So that's why I use the term eco-crucifixion, also noting that there is another side here, which a lot of times eco-theologians don't develop, is that there must also be an eco-resurrection. That while we are heading towards what I believe is the Good Friday of our planet, that we need to continue this work, because we don't want to say, well, it's going to happen, there's nothing we can do, and just resign ourselves to apathy or to numbness or to just giving up. That we are called to continue to do this work, knowing and in faith, knowing that God is also working in ways that we can't even see. We have, we can only catch little glimpses of it, but God is still at work in the world. And even as we are going to the tomb, God is already coming towards us and meeting us, and we're going to discover what I believe is something amazing and joyful and surprising in the eco-resurrection. So that's one of the things that this creation crisis preaching is helping to engender that for people, to help them to develop a creative imagination to think through that process.
Two premises. There is a dire need for all creation, inclusive of humanity, to hear the good news of the Christian faith in this age of planetary environmental devastation. And two, contemporary Christian preaching, if it is to be responsible to one of the primary justice issues of our time, and if it is to be relevant in the lives of our hearers, must address creation care on a regular basis. The church denominations seem fine with covering contentious issues such as gay rights, gay marriage, Ferguson, Black Lives Matter, and refugees, but cover climate change issues far less and only rarely. It just makes me wonder what's going on.
Well, I think what people need to realize is that almost all of those justice issues that you mentioned, Black Lives Matter, the LGBTQ debate, the refugees, all of them are impacted in some way.
Yep.
And exacerbated by climate disruption.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, when we think about Black Lives Matter, we also have to note that when we think about the pollution, the air pollution in our society, and in a congregation that I served in Yeadon, Pennsylvania, which is a suburb of Philly, I asked one time, I was preaching a sermon about the need to protect our air, and I asked how many of you either have asthma or know someone in your immediate family who does, and I would say 90% of the congregation raised their hand. So that pollution that we're putting into the air that's causing climate change is causing all other kinds of pollution as well. So when we think about Black Lives Matter, we have to connect that to climate change. When we think about the refugee crisis, it's not just about politics. It's not just about military. It's not just about people trying to find another economic opportunity. It's exacerbated because of climate change, because because there's not enough water, because there's not enough food, so when you have a conflict, it's exacerbated by the loss of resources. They're fighting over resources, very limited resources. And so the ones who are most vulnerable are the ones that are most often affected and brutalized in the fierce competition for the dwindling resources that are brought about by climate change. So you have to be able to connect that. When we think about LGBTQ issues, when we look at the homeless youth, a large majority of homeless youth are LGBTQ individuals who have been ejected from their homes, right, from their communities. They're living on the streets. So when you have a severe weather event come up the East Coast, as what happened with Sandy, and you have people that are displaced, that, a large reason why they're there in the first place is because of their rejection, and then it's again exacerbated by these severe weather events that come along and just devastate those who don't have the resources to be able to cope with what's coming our way. So so all of these things in some way is touched by climate change.
Given the fact that the majority of religious leaders do not address environmental issues in their sermons more than a few times a year, if at all, it may be that what is needed are models and frameworks to help preachers craft sermons that are informed by an environmental hermeneutic consistent with ecological theology, attentive to the context of their hearers, and creatively inspired to include the voice of creation within preaching. This book aims to offer just that. More specifically, I insist that environmental preaching intentionally incorporate the joint and interrelated oppression of women and creation if it is to be faithful to Jesus' command to tend to the least of these on our planet. Thus, this book offers the unique lens of ecofeminist Christology through which to interpret both Scripture and the environmental context of our time.
Well, one of the things that ecofeminists point out is the fact that we can't separate the the work that we do to liberate women without also recognizing that we need to liberate Earth and vice versa, because we feminize the natural world and we animalize or naturize women. So what I mean by that is just take a look at our language. When we think about how we talk about the natural world, we talk about virgin timber, we talk about barren soil, we talk about raping the land. I mean, these all have to do with a woman's body and childbirth and sexual violence. We talk about Mother Earth. I mean, that's sort of an archetype that is found throughout many different religions. At the same time, think about the negative terms that we use to describe women. We will call her a chick, a fox. Um, I don't know if I can say that it's in the broadcast, but it rhymes with witch, but it starts with a B. Think of how we refer to the parts of a woman. Those are animal terms. So we are dehumanizing women in our very language. We make them other than human, which when you think about the pyramid, the hierarchy in which the patriarchal worldview is constructed, where you have God here at the top, and then privileged men at this next tier, and then you have privileged women, but of course are subordinate to them, and then you have people of color, and then even within that, you have like a little triangle of men on top, and then women, and then children. But then down here, you've got the whole rest of the natural world. So the ones that are closest to the natural world, by this logic, can be dominated, can be brought into subservience by the ones on top, including God. It's this way of thinking authorizes those right under that believe themselves to be right underneath the divine to control and manipulate and use all of this for their purposes. So we have to rethink our paradigm. We have to rethink the way we imagine the relationship between humanity and God to be more like a web where everything is all interconnected. All of the strands are interconnected. When I was at the Parliament, I heard a really wonderful metaphor to think about the need for equality of women in all spheres. And I believe it came from the Baha'i faith, I'm pretty sure. But they said that humanity is like a bird, and men are one wing and women are the other wing. And if you don't have both wings equal, the bird simply cannot fly. It may be able to flop around for a while if it's got one healthy wing and the other one's kind of down like this. It might be able to flop around, but it really cannot take flight. So what we're saying really is humanity not truly taking flight in the way that it's meant to, by not allowing women to have control over their bodies, the right to vote, the same level of education, property rights, the ability to choose who they will marry. All of those things go into women having being equal wings of the bird. So as we are working towards ecological justice, we also have to be including justice for women. And we cannot include justice for women unless we are also looking at the impact that their lives have on the environment and the way they suffer the most by environmental devastation. So that's one way to think about the connection between ecofeminism and the larger justice issues.
On blasphemy against the Spirit. In just 200 years, 165 million years of creation was being undone by the very ones who were the shining light of that creation, The carbon dioxide and methane overwhelmed the oxygen, trapping heat and causing Earth's fever to rise. This was blasphemy against the Spirit, the unforgivable sin. For if the very essence of life, God's breath, ruah, is destroyed, there can be no breath, no life for anyone or anything. It is unforgivable because there is no return. Once the balance tips too far, the cascading effects on the oceans, the ice sheets, the mountains, and the climate cycles falls too fast to stop. Yeah.
Because what's happening, and I'm taking a very specific eco-hermeneutic and I'm applying it to that text where Jesus talks about the unforgivable sin. Mm-hmm. And I've always sort of puzzled about this, like, what could be so unforgivable? Why would Jesus was all about love and forgiveness. Why would Jesus say that there is an unforgivable sin, and why is it blaspheming the Spirit? And I've struggled with this for years. And it wasn't until I started thinking about, okay, so who is the Spirit? Who is the Spirit? What is the Spirit? The Spirit is, in Hebrew thought, it is ruach. It is the breath of God. It is the pneuma, in Greek terms. It is the ruach also has the connotation again of a mother bird hovering over the nest egg of earth. Mm-hmm. So breath, wind, spirit. So when you think about that in terms of the body of God being earth, using Sally McFague's notion of earth being God's body. Mm-hmm. And so if that's the case, then the air really is the pneuma, the spirit is the body's air. So when you put so much carbon dioxide into the air that there is this cascading effect that eventually life as we know it simply cannot continue. We're approaching a tipping point where we're choking the very air of the planet. And once that happens, once you've reached that tipping point, it's like when you're going down over the waterfall, you can't come back. I mean, there's no coming back from that. So it's not that God is saying, I'm not going to give you for this sin. It is simply a recognition of, here are the consequences for taking these actions that are leading you down this road. We are already on this road. The question is, how fast, how far are we going to fall, and who are we going to help on the way down, and how can we minimize the effects of this? What is our faith? What is our religion calling us to do to mitigate the worst effects of climate disruption? Because we're already experiencing it. I mean, just look at the number of catastrophic weather events, the droughts, the invasive species, loss of habitat, the acidification of the oceans, coral reefs dying. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. It's already happening. We live on a different planet than we did even 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. So we're approaching a point where there's no coming back. And so part of the task of religions is to say that this is absolutely, it's a spiritual, it's a moral, it's an ethical issue. We've got to be talking about this in our pulpits, in our Bible studies, at the church-wide larger level, because we have to be part of this movement to turn things back or slow things down as much as possible.
I read this book by George Marshall, Don't Even Think About It, Why Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change, that does a real good job of exploring a range of forms of climate denial and other reactions, or lack thereof. What do you make of all this?
Say the reaction to climate disruption can be compared to the stages of grief that people have when you look at Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's model, what happens, and the first stage when you realize, oh my gosh, mom's got cancer, is denial.
Right.
Like, no, I just saw mom yesterday. She's fine. Everything's fine. Like you can't even process it. And then there's the stage of anger, which we see a lot of in this country. This, it can't be this, this very kind of negative reaction, and just fighting against the reality of what's happening. and that sort of backlash and just sort of lashing out and raging. I think we're seeing a lot of that in the country. And then there's the sort of bargaining. Like if I just use LED light bulbs, then it'll be okay. Can we avert the problem then? If I just recycle a little more, then we'll be okay, right? And it's not. It's not going to be okay. We've got some serious issues at these little things. We can't bargain our way into this. And then there's the stage of just overwhelming grief and sadness, which, for those who have really processed what's going on here, people are very, very depressed about this. One of my parishioners sent me an article looking at the deep despair that climate scientists have, knowing what they know, but then also being told that they're idiots, or that they're politicizing their work, and just very deep, just breaking of the heart. And then the final stage is acceptance, the saying, okay, yes, it's happening. Yes, we're the cause of it. Yes, we have to do something. All of these things, they're all still there, but okay, so now what? And then you start to do the work of caring for the woundedness of Earth and the climate, and you start looking at, okay, how can we come together as a family, come together as a community, whatever we have to do. And so the quicker we can move through these stages and really kind of mobilize people to do the work, the better. And that's why the churches have to be right on the front lines of this. And so to recognize when people have that sort of stonewall, like, I don't want to talk about this, or that very negative reaction, that's a very human thing. That's a very natural reaction to the reality that we're seeing. And so how can we help people process through those quicker? That's one of the things that I'm very interested in seeing how we can do that.
Yeah.
Something I've been thinking about lately is the story of Tower of Babel, and whether or not this is a key passage for eco-theology or a candidate for an eco-treatment.
Well,
I have not heard an eco treatment of that, so now you've got my wheels turning, thinking, okay, so how can we do this? And in many ways, I mean, that's exactly what we're seeing. The global corporate neoliberalism system is that Tower of Babel. And the difference now, though, is that there's no divine mixing up the languages. I mean, in many ways, the humanity is kind of right back in that Tower of Babel situation, where the language of technology has really, currency and wealth really has become the common language. And so I have to admit, there's a part of me that is sort of with a Job-like anger towards God, saying, what are you doing? There's a lot of us down here that are trying, I shouldn't say down here, because it's got that whole hierarchical thing, but you fall back into this pattern. There's a lot of us that are trying to do this work that you've called us to do. What are you doing? Please do something. Do something. We need some kind of divine intervention here. Whatever it is, you give us all these stories of the crossing of the Red Sea and the, mixing up the languages, and there's all these stories. So we need that. We needed, first of all, to see it with eyes of faith, and then to be able to tell that story, to narrate that story as it's happening. And it's not. And I'm sure I know it's happening because I'm a person of faith, but it's not. I'm a little panicky because it's not happening fast enough. I mean, just every day, more and more species just gone, not coming back. More and more people, expelled from their countries. We're in the greatest migration of human population since World War II. And the majority of this is climate driven. More and more weather events. I mean, it's stunning to me. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, God, so yeah, we're those of us, we're trying to do this work. A little help here. So I would love to see something that kind of is God, saying, yeah, let's just do something a little fun, and mix up their languages, and then the tower gets abandoned.
Yeah.
Or I'm kind of I'm waiting in hope and faith and trying to see where that's happening, and I'm in anxious anticipation for that.
Mm.
When I think of how 250 years ago we went all in for fuel-driven, carbon-emitting mass production and transportation, along with its resulting mass CO2 imbalances it began to produce, and that it was considered a miracle then. People today still point to that in defending the fossil fuel industry, essentially joining it to capitalism at the hip, and therefore using that "look at how many people have been raised out of poverty" thing.
Which is exactly the opposite of it's actually done the net effect
Yeah.
has been exactly the opposite.
Yeah.
And that's part of the hegemony
Mm-hmm.
that convinces people who are oppressed by that very system to tout its wonders and to say this is the best thing ever. Well, that's part of the, from a Marxist perspective, that's the mechanism that the bourgeoisie uses to keep people doing what they're doing in order to, support that system. So a lot of times we vote against our best interests, we work against our best interests, we watch television news programs that are working against our
Yeah.
best interests,
Yeah.
but we're just saying, yes, this is the way to go. And there's a severe lack of critical thinking, a lack of education, a lack of being able to say, let's take a step back here and say, okay, what's really going on here? How follow the money, follow the power. There's a massive shortage of that, and that's a huge concern of mine. That even students in the class where I teach, they don't always have those skills of critical thinking, and they're resistant to even learning them.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a concern for me.
Mm.
I will say, I mean, I do, especially after having been to the Parliament. I think now more than ever, there's more awareness of environmental and especially climate disruption issues. I think more and more houses of worship are seeing, first of all, the morally compelling reasons to address this, but also seeing that there are wonderful opportunities to be relevant, to connect with people on the issues that they really care about, and to do some just wonderful ministry. Like for example, just a very small anecdote. I've done a lot of work as a fractivist, going to protests and I encounter a lot of people in that work who have no connection with religion whatsoever, but we share the same values.
Yeah.
And I've created a lot of really wonderful friendships through these groups. And so one of the activists called up and said, "Hey, I'm getting married. Would you perform a wedding ceremony?" And
That's great.
it's beautiful. She wants to have it very earth-centered and that sort of thing. And I thought, so there's an opportunity. Like if I had not, and that's not the reason I went into this. It was not. I'm not about trying to proselytize people to Christianity. I'm trying to proselytize people to earth consciousness. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. But what a wonderful opportunity to be this pastoral presence for this couple that would have had no connection to, it doesn't have a connection to a church, and now through this work we found that. I mean, that to me, that's one of the silver linings in this work. I mean, it galls me that I have to do this as a pastor, that I have to stand up for the earth. I mean, that should be a given. But how wonderful that I've made these connections with people, and they've made these connections with me, and they're really grace-filled moments. So that's one thing that I do really appreciate. It's really been a blessing.
As Leah Schade told us in her story about how she came to an ecological sensitivity and brought it along with her into her ministry, She couldn't stay silent in the pulpit or in her sense for what the church could do to be active in opposing fracking in her neck of the woods. This kind of action has been taking place around the globe, and people of faith are among the crowd, many times organizing and leading the efforts. It is, as Leah points out, standing up for the least of these, for the earth, our common home, and for the people who so dearly depend on the bounty of creation for their very lives. These are being threatened by the seemingly unending expansion of the fossil fuel economy.
I remembered a phrase debated by the U.S. government in the 1970s. It was suggested that some places may have to be sacrifice areas. If we're going to keep digging up fossil fuels, those places will just be destroyed. What they didn't say is that the people who live on those lands get sacrificed too. But a strange thing happened as the fossil fuel economy spread over the world. The sacrifice zone got bigger and bigger.
The protest shown in that clip was at the Alberta tar sands. The people in the sacrifice zones, such as this, standing up to those who would sacrifice them and their lands, Naomi Klein calls blockadia. This blockadia is happening around the world and is, in fact, an act of faith. It's standing up and blocking the destructive activity. But it needs strong communal energy. It's important, as we heard Tim DeChristopher say in the previous episode, for us to make meaning in the crisis, which, for the church, is to look at it all in the context of the activity of the kingdom of God, or as Clarence Jordan translated it, the God movement. And as God's Spirit, the Ruach, moves around and through us, are attending to that, and standing with one another to let our gatherings celebrate this, we can begin to not only experience healing ourselves, but move to see that the healing of the earth is not postponed, that we can join the homecoming.
Because of the way that our society is structured, some people have access to nature and some people don't. And some people have access to clean air and some people don't, or fresh food, or clean water, or access to green-collar jobs, or whatever. And I realized that the earth and environmentalism and this sacred connection that I felt is also a deeply racialized issue and an economic issue as well.